Thank you, everyone, and I'd just like to thank Nala and Inez for inviting me to talk to you today about PIAC. I think there are a few people who saw me talk yesterday, so unfortunately you'll have to put up with some of the same things. I hope that's not too dull, but given that I think there's a bit of a changeover of audience, I think it's important to give everyone the same basic information. Obviously it's quite an appropriate venue today to talk about one of the most interesting aspects of PIAC, which is its assessment of what we're calling problem solving in technology rich environments. And basically the intent of my presentation today is really to provide you an overview of the assessment of problem solving in technology rich environments in PIAC, as well as explain some of the other features that relate to skills that are very relevant in a digital environment. And to do that, I'll just run briefly through a bit of background to the survey, give you an overview of some of the features of PIAC, which is a computer-based assessment, which is obviously essential if one's going to assess digital skills. Give you an idea of some of the features of what we understand by problem solving in a technology-rich environments, talk about digital reading, and give you an idea of some of the other information that's collected in the survey about the use of information and communication technologies both at home and at work. Now this is the bit that some of you have already seen, but just to give you a bit of background to PIAC. Essentially, work began on PIAC in the early 2000s. PIAC is the successor to a couple of other international surveys of adult literacy, numeracy and problem solving. I think many of you would be aware that there was the International Adult Literacy Survey that was undertaken, I think, between 1994 to 1998. There were 3 waves of that survey. Ireland took part in the first wave in 1994. There was a second part of the evolution of these surveys was there was a second survey that was developed largely by Statistics Canada called the Adult Literacy and Life Skills Survey. A number of 13 countries, I think, took part in that between 2003 and 2006. PIAC, in a sense, draws quite heavily on those previous surveys, but it's essentially the objective of PIAC was to update these surveys of adult literacy, understood in a very wide sense, to the 21st century or the digital age. So to bring in elements that were relevant to the way that we manage information in the 21st century. So that was one of the main drivers behind PIAC. There are also other drivers, including a growing interest in getting information on about a wider range of skills, certainly interest in generic skills, interest in not only looking at what we might call the supply side, what the skills of the population are, what skills people have, but also get some idea about what kind of skills are actually demanded, particularly in the labour market, but also in society more generally. And then also an overarching interest, in a sense, in going a bit beyond just these specific skills of literacy and numeracy, but to get a fix to some extent on what one might call human capital embodied in individuals and nations, which is in a sense the bundle of skills, attributes and knowledge that have value either on the labour market or in society. That's obviously a very ambitious agenda, but just to give you an idea of some of the kind of intellectual currents which were behind the development of PIAC. Obviously this is just this is a slide showing access to computers and the internet at home, and just to emphasise, I guess, the importance that we all know and we realise of these new tools that in interacting with businesses, with governments and between individuals. And in most of the OECD countries you've got upwards to almost 90% of households in Iceland, for example, have access to the internet at home and have a computer at home. And for most of the OECD countries, it's above 60% for both. Obviously, there are some countries at the end, the other end of the scale, leaving aside Mexico. But I mean, Italy, Spain, Hungary, Poland have relatively low, relatively low. I mean, they've still got over 50%, around 40 to 50% of the population have access. But in most of the large advanced OECD countries, penetration of computers is in the home is very important, and obviously this is one of the major pieces of one of the major drivers of the development of PIAC that I'll talk about today. Essentially, the design of PIAC was finalised in about 2007 with, I think, 3 broad objectives. So provide high quality and comparable information on the level and distribution of key information processing skills in the adult population. And by key information processing skills, we're really meaning these literacy, numeracy and problem solving in technology-rich environments. We also, that one of the main objectives again was to show the relationship of these skills to individual and social outcomes. So how do these skills impact people's employment chances? How do they impact on people's chances of salaries or wages? How do they have an impact on other aspects of social life? For example, health. We've got measures of trust, social trust, and also participation in volunteering activities. So, not only what the level of these skills are in the population, but how they have an impact on people's lives. And also, another key objective is to better understand the processes through which these skills are gained, maintained and lost over the life cycle. And I think that's important because one of the features of PIAC is it's a survey of the entire adult population aged between 16 and 65. And someone will probably ask me, why didn't we go beyond 65? And you can ask that question later. But it gives you, we're looking at a very large age range, people who went to school at the end of the 1940s and people who are still in school today. And that covers an awfully wide range of experience over the post-war period in most OECD countries. One of the interesting things there is while it's a cross-sectional survey, it does give us some understanding of how these skills change with age, and we can get some better understanding of both what processes help people maintain their skills as they age, and also what kind of factors can lead people to lose skills. And I think some of the interesting evidence that will come out of the survey is that, well, I think there's obviously biological processes going on. Social processes also matter quite a lot in terms of how people maintain and lose skills over the life cycle. Okay, so in terms of the design features, what do we have? We have basically what we call a direct assessment of these skills, and that's a test. We have a test of literacy, and I'll explain what we have there, which includes something called reading components. We have a test of numeracy, and we have a test of problem solving in technology-rich environments. The tests here are linked to IALs and ALS in the domain. They're the 2 previous surveys in the domains of literacy and numeracy. We use some of the same items, and the test is designed in a way that will allow us to look at change over time in performance in these particular domains. So literacy, we can go back to the International Adult Literacy Survey and also the Adult Literacy and Life Skills Survey. In terms of numeracy, we can only go back to all because in the International Adult Literacy Survey there was something called quantitative literacy, which was related to the understanding of numbers in text, but it wasn't quite the same as the concept of numeracy that we're using today. Okay, we also collect a range of information on the use of literacy, numeracy and problem solving at work and elsewhere. We also have information on a range of generic skills at work, and these essentially cover 4 domains: interaction with others, organisation of self and others, learning skills and physical skills. And then we get information on antecedents and outcomes, and by that I mean in terms of antecedents, educational attainment, social background, literacy, language background, immigration, etc. And in terms of outcomes, there we look at things such as labour force status, so employment, unemployment, salaries, and also in terms of social outcomes we have measures of health, of social trust, of volunteering, and something we call political efficacy, which is beliefs about one's impact on the political process. Okay, design features, just briefly here again. The target population, as I've said, is 16 to 65-year-olds. The sample, it's a sample representative of the target population, so it's a representative sample of the population of that age in the National Territory. It's a household survey, so the information was collected by interviewers going out to individuals' houses, knocking on the door and asking them if they'd participate, and then when they said yes, sitting down with them with a laptop and getting them to do the test. It was also delivered on computer, and this is probably the first time that we've had such a large-scale adult literacy numeracy survey conducted on computer. The background questionnaires are what we call a CAPI application, a computer-aided personal interview, and then the assessment was actually people sat down with the computer and did the test on a computer. And I'll show you, give you some examples of what the kind of things that they did in a minute. Round 1, 24 countries. I won't go most of the major OECD countries. Round 2, we have another group of, in fact, 9 countries that's undertaking the assessment at the study at the moment, and we'll have results in 2015, 2016. Okay, so what's assessed? As I've said, literacy. So that's basically reading literacy. It's not writing, because you can't test writing in this kind of large-scale international test. Numeracy, that's essentially the individual's ability to grapple with with numbers and mathematical concepts, including space, quantity, probability. So the kind of broad mathematical concepts that you need to operate in everyday life. And then we have the domain of problem solving in technology-rich environments, which is really the subject of today's talk. I'll just to repeat a bit about the computer-based assessment. We've talked about CAPI. Just one point that needs to be made about the computer-based assessment is that the assessment was taken by most people on a laptop, using a purpose-built application. Of course, there's a number of people in most countries that either have no experience with computers or low experience with computers, and a pencil and paper version of the assessment in literacy and numeracy was available for those people. And the proportions that actually went on the pencil and paper test varied quite widely between countries. Now this just gives you an idea of the pathway through the assessment. Just to show you the two paths, and also to give you some idea about the kind of information that's in there. So, in a sense, people, when the interviewer went out to the home, they'd done the background questionnaire, and then they was basically assessed on the basis of the background questionnaire whether one should go further on in terms of using the computer. So for those people who'd said in response to a question, have you ever used a computer before? They said no. They were immediately directed to the paper and pencil. So they did literacy and numeracy, and that's on the left-hand side of the assessment. Then, for those people who'd said that they'd had some computer experience, they went and did what we call the ICT test, stage 1, the ICT core. And that was and I'll explain a bit, that's a basic test of basic computer skills. If they failed that, in a sense, I think there were something like 6 test items. If they failed, if they got 2 or 3 incorrect, I can't remember the exact number. They were then directed to the paper-based assessment, and only those people who showed that they could use the had the necessary skills to undertake the test on a computer went forward. Now these were pretty basic skills. There were also a group of people who actually opted out of the computer-based assessment. Those were people who said that they had computer skills, but they preferred to take the test on pencil and paper. Interviewers tried to minimise that as much as they could, but if people said, "I don't want to do it," they they didn't do it. they did the pencil and paper, and I think our understanding of those people is that they tend to be older, they tend to be people of lower levels of education, and they tend to be people who have lower proficiency in literacy and numeracy. So then, if you passed the ICT core, then you went on to do a computer-based, what we call the literacy and numeracy core, and that was 3 pretty simple literacy and numeracy tasks. The idea there was to say if people have got people are poor readers or have low numeracy, there's no point in subjecting them to the horror of having to go through a full test. So they said, well, we know you've got low skills, so then we direct you directly to this thing called the reading components test, which was a very basic test of some basic components of reading, so vocabulary knowledge, understanding the logic of sentences, and being able to fluently read passages of text. Then if you passed the if you passed the literacy and numeracy core, then you went on to do the rest of the test. Okay, so just going back to the ICT core, the ICT core tested the basic skills to complete the assessment on a computer. So that was the use of a mouse, being able to scroll through text, being able to drag and drop, and to be able to highlight, because those are the kind of functionalities one had to use to be able to answer the questions in the computer-based part of the test. And this included computer-based numeracy, computer-based literacy, and the domain of problem solving. Okay, now yesterday I talked about literacy, but today I'll talk more about what problem solving in technology-rich environments and what exactly it is we mean by this. And you've got the definition there. And essentially, in broad terms, problem solving in technology-rich environments is a way of measuring individuals' capacity to access, analyse, and to some extent communicate information in a computer environment, so an internet environment, or using applications such as word processing, spreadsheets, databases, emails. So, it's an attempt to measure how people can do the kinds of things that they're required to do in everyday life in these kind of environments. How do they find out information on the internet? How do they evaluate that? How do they go ahead and organise a group of people to go to a football match and buy the tickets on the internet? How do they organise making a choice between what kind of lampshades or lamps that you can buy on an internet shopping site? Things like that. They're very much based around the kind of things that one does in everyday life. So essentially, and part of the objective there is to get away from a notion of computer literacy, which is focused on just the use of the technology. The focus here is you can use the technology to do things that matter in your life. That you can use the technology to access, to manipulate information, to access information, transform it, and communicate it. So problem solving in technology-rich environments is defined as using digital technology, communication tools and networks to acquire and evaluate information, communicate with others and perform practical tasks. There's a sub thing there which focuses on the fact that the first cycle of this focuses on the abilities to solve problems for personal work and civic purposes by setting up appropriate goals and plans, and accessing and making use of information through computers and computer networks. So it was very much focused on computers and not on other sort of ICT devices such as smartphones, etc. Now, I mean, that's the broad definition of problem solving in technology and in technology-rich environments. I mean, how do we go ahead and operationalise that in terms of developing a test? Well, the way that you go about it is we develop what we call a framework, an assessment framework, which in a sense defines the construct and the dimensions of this thing that we're measuring in a way that you can operationalise it in the development of test items. And by test items we mean the questions, the stimulus and the questions that people have to answer to do the test. So there we have three dimensions. The first is content, and that's in a sense the corpus of texts or problems or that people have to respond to. The second is cognitive strategies, and essentially there what we're looking at is, what kind of mental operations do people have to undertake to get meaning out of texts or to solve problems. And then the context, and I see here I've forgotten to change the thing from reading, but the context is with the situation in which you're operating to solve a problem. And the objective here in all of these areas is to try and cover as much as we can of the kind of content that an adult in a reasonably advanced society and economy will have to deal with. We want to cover the types of cognitive strategies that underpin the process of getting meaning out of these and responding to and solving problems. And we also want to get items that cover, or stimulus material for the items that cover the range of context in which people work and solve problems. So, in terms of content for technology, for this domain of problem solving in technology-rich environments, there are two main components. The first is the technology, and that's the content there is the hardware devices, the software applications, commands and functions and representations, so text, graphics and video, that one has to respond to as a user of a computer. And then the second dimension, the second part of that is in terms of the content dimension, is the tasks. And this is the actual problems which one has to grapple with. And those problems are defined largely in terms of their intrinsic complexity. So that's how difficult the problem is, how complex the solution path is from getting to the initial statement of the problem to a solution. And the other major dimension there which is defined is the explicitness of the problem statement. So problems that are very ill-defined are usually more difficult to undertake than ones in which you've got a clear view about what you have to do, what you have to solve. So that's the dimension there. In terms of cognitive strategies, there are four which are defined. So the process of setting goals and monitoring progress, planning, acquiring and evaluating information, and using information. And in terms of the context, well, basically we have work-related, personal, and society and community. And I'll just run through and give you an example of a problem-solving item. And I'm conscious that being in the offices of Google, this is probably the most low-tech presentation that's ever taken place in this, because I can't do a groovy presentation in which I can click through the items for you, unfortunately. But this is an example of a problem-solving item. This is the kind of screen that the test taker would see. So on the left, on the right, we have a stimulus, which is a simulated website, Or it's actually a simulated results page from an internet search, and on the left you have a question. And in the assessment, we did make an attempt to provide a simulated, in a sense, a simulated web environment was the usual environment that people operated in, with a capacity to access email, usually a simple word processor or a spreadsheet function, for example. And also, you can click on all of those links and you'll be taken to another page. In some cases, the pages will just be blank with a note saying, please go back, because one can't simulate the infinite regress that one gets into in an internet environment. But so an attempt was made to simulate an environment. Obviously, it's a very reduced environment, but it has most of the major features that people see in a web environment. And here I think the question is, you're looking for a job and have located 5 websites. Oh, my eyes are so bad, but I mean, essentially you're meant to click on one of them. So then you click on one, and you get to this site called work links. There's an option to bookmark. Bookmark all the sites that meet your requirements. So basically you've got to click through the 5 websites that were on the previous screen, find out the one that meets your requirements, and then bookmark it. And if you do that, you got part of this question correct. And then I think the question is, you want to use a site that does not require you to pay a fee. So therefore you've got to click through more information on the websites to find out whether there's information there that gives you an idea about, tells you whether you have to pay a fee for the services that are operated by that particular website. So this is a simple problem-solving item. It's probably quite related, very close to what we call a digital reading item as well. But that's just to give you an idea of the nature of the test and the kind of test items that people have to do in this domain. Just moving on, it's not only problem solving in technology-rich environments that gives us some information about people's capacity to access and understand information in the digital world, but also the reading assessment contained quite a lot of stimulus material that was web-based. And there, the idea was to get an idea of not only how people read stuff on print, but also how they read in an internet or digital environment. And so I think some 50% of the test items covered digital texts. And by digital text we mean a text that is screen-based. It has features such as hyperlinks, so you can click on another link and you're taken off somewhere else. It has very specific navigation features that you don't find in text. You don't have to turn the pages, you have to scroll down, or you have to move through pages by clicking on buttons or whatever. And in a sense, a digital text is defined too by being, in a sense, often being an unbounded information space. If you look at a website like this, which is Le Monde from 2007, you see some of the features of a digital text, which are fundamentally that, there's a lot of information there provided in quite short. This is not for all of them, but quite short phrases. You can click on various links that'll take you anywhere. You've got ads, you've got photos that change, etc., etc. And in a sense, by clicking on some of these links, you'll get to another page where you can click on another link and click on another link and another link and another link, and by 5 minutes later you'll be miles away from Le Monde. So that's what we mean by an unbounded information space, which in a sense can be distinguished from that offered by a print-based text. And here we have the second page of Le Monde from about the same time, and here this page just gives the people an idea of what's of some of the key articles in the paper. But here you can see you get a bit of information about a lot of stuff, but to get to the next page you've got to turn to page 13 or 15. And there's not the same amount of competing information. You've got photos, but they don't, you haven't got videos, you haven't got ads that pop up and distract you. I mean, it's a very different experience, in a sense, reading often reading in a digital environment to reading in a print-based environment. And while I think the research tends to show that the cognitive skills required in both cases are very similar, they certainly do offer, they do have some major differences, and we've certainly tried to get a handle on how people can read these digital texts in PIAC. As I said, the information that we get is not only in the assessment, but we also get information on what people do in terms of use of ICTs. And here what we try and do is get a picture of the variety, frequency and complexity of ICT use. By variety we mean the range of applications or the range of tasks that people do. The frequency, do they do it often or not very much? And complexity, we want again to have an idea of what are the more, do people do simpler or more complex tasks in terms of use of ICT. So we get some information on whether they've ever used a computer or other digital device, whether they currently use computers, whether they use emails, whether they use the internet to get access to information, whether they conduct transactions on the internet, whether they use spreadsheet software, word processing software, use programming languages, or participate in discussion groups. Now, I mean, obviously, this doesn't cover we haven't. There are probably other applications and functionality and that people use, but I think this gives us a fair idea about the range of uses that people engage in, adults engage in terms of use of ICTs. And then we also get some information on the level of the people's beliefs about the level of computer use they need to perform their job if they're in employment. We ask them some questions about whether they possess sufficient computer skills to do that job well, and also a question about whether the lack of computer skills has affected their chances of promotion or getting a pay rise. Okay, so that's the kind of information that we get from the survey, and I think you'll see that it's quite a rich range of information. How do we present the results for the results of the tests at the level of the population? So the results are presented. It's a test, so we present the results on a 500-point scale, and I think the mean is about 270, I think, if my memory serves me correctly. And basically this is a scale which allows you to represent both the difficulty of the items. So an item is more difficult if it has a higher value. It's less difficult if it has a low value. And also the proficiency of the individuals. So an individual is regarded as being more proficient if they're closer to 500 than 1. And vice versa. So both individuals and the items are represented on the scale. And in a sense, what does it mean for a person to have be at a particular point on the scale? So if we look at adult B, which we can take as being having a performance around the mean, what does that mean? Essentially, it means that that person can undertake an item or successfully complete a test item that's at the same point of the scale 2 times out of 3, that they can successfully complete items at lower points in the scale most of the time, and that they can successfully complete items at higher points in the scale some of the time. So wherever you are on the scale, you have a probability of at least of doing all of the items at least some of the time, but the more difficult items you have a very low chance, and the easier items, depending on where you are, the items below where you are, you have a much higher chance. So essentially that's to give you some idea about what it means to be on a scale. It's not these kind of tests are not a yes/no scale. That there's you're never at a point where you can't do something that's more difficult. I guess the other thing just to mention about the scales, and that's something I didn't mention yesterday, is that the objective really is to get an idea of the continuum of performance. So this is a scale which encompasses both people with very high skills and very low skills. So it's to get a picture of the performance of the population as a whole, and it just doesn't focus, for example, on low skills. And the second thing is that there's no notion in any of this of something that you might call computer illiteracy, or in terms of reading, illiteracy. We're looking at, it's a continuum of literacy or a continuum of problem-solving ability that goes from quite low and goes to very high. So it's a scale of increasing, you have increasing amounts of this thing called problem-solving ability or literacy ability. And just to make the point that there's certainly no idea that there's a cut-off which defines those people who are illiterate or computer illiterate from those that are not. Okay, so to help us understand what it means to be on the scale, we divide the scale into proficiency levels, and so those are score point ranges. We develop descriptors to summarise the underlying characteristics of the test items in each of the levels. And here again, the purpose of this is descriptive, not normative. It's to help people understand what someone who's got a particular score on this test can do, described in terms of the underlying abilities or underlying factors that cause items at particular points to be more or less difficult. It's not normative in the sense that we don't say that people have to have a particular level of proficiency to be successful in life or anything like that. We just say that these are the kinds of things you can do if you're at that particular level of proficiency. Effectively, we have 4 levels of proficiency in problem solving, and there are the ranges. It's level 3 is the highest, and level 1 is the lowest, and then we also have a less than level 1. And just to give you an idea of some of the kind of descriptors, the language that we use, I won't, obviously you've got that in your handouts, so there's no point in reading through it, but just to make a couple of points about this. So essentially what we try and do in the descriptors is look at things about, such as for the kind of applications and functionality that people can deal with at a particular level, as well as the kind of reasoning skills and the difficulties of solution paths to get to the solution of a problem. And so, for example, in level 1, the kind of tasks there that define level 1 are those that involve very few applications, very few functions, and basically only very simple reasoning and very simple solution paths to get to the solution of a problem. Whereas level 3, which is the highest level, you have much higher demands in terms of much higher technical demands in terms of being able to use functionality. You have a complex solution path, so there's what we call impasses. There are, you can come to a point in a problem where you get blocked and you have to go back and find another way around, and you often have to use higher order reasoning capacity. So that just gives you an idea of the kind of way that we describe the levels. Yep. Okay, so what can we get out of this? And you'll all have to wait until the 8th of October to see the full results. But just to give you an idea of the kind of information that we can get out of this. For example, the digital divide. What proportion of the population has no or very low computer skills? Who are they? What are their background characteristics? Etc. How proficient are we at adults at managing information in digital environments? Again, are there differences between countries? How are these skills distributed in the population by age, gender, education, etc.? Again, what are the characteristics of poor performers? and what kind of tasks the generality of the population successfully complete. And I think these are actually talking to someone from Canada quite recently about this. I mean, one of the things they were interested in is that in the context, for example, of governments increasingly requiring people to access public information on the internet, was this going to actually create another divide in the sense that unless you present information in a way that everyone or the majority of people can get access to it, there's a risk of exclusion. And in a sense, this is probably one of the few pieces of information we have about what people can do and how well can the generality of the population navigate through a complex website. I mean, we're all very well educated people, and I must admit I have difficulties with a lot of the websites in the world. And so, as we increasingly put information onto the internet, I mean, is this going to have an effect? Is this actually going to make access easier, which everyone says it does, or is it actually going to make access more difficult for some people? Literacy in the digital world. I mean, is the so-called digital divide as much a literacy divide as an ICT divide? And I think we will find some. I mean, there's some information that comes out that shows that to perform well on the problem solving in technology-rich environments, you basically have to have a high level of literacy, and that poor performance is associated with low levels of literacy. Now, what's the interaction? What's the causality? Is it from literacy to problem solving in technology-rich environments, or vice versa, or is it in a sense a feedback loop? It's probably a feedback loop, but there appears to be a strong relationship, and in a sense that just confirms, I think, what most of us know, that the internet is a literary environment. It's to operate in the internet, you've really got to be able to read. Computer use in the labour market. What skills are required? What skills do people have? And what are the returns in terms of, monetary returns, or returns in terms of employment chances to having good or bad computer skills? I mean, they're just some of the things that we can look at. And I think they'll provide a wealth of information for researchers and policymakers. In terms of what we're getting out of the survey, in October, on the 8th of October, we'll have the release of the information. We'll have the release of the international report. We'll have a release of what we're calling a public use data set, which is the results, a unit record results file for every country. My own country, Australia excluded, and we also have a data explorer tool, which is a tool that allows members of the public to actually get some information from the survey. So, for the lay person to get information to produce tables and graphics. Something called the data analyzer, which is a tool that helps researchers get access to the data. And we'll also have a range of other documentation, which is of interest probably for the specialists. We'll have a technical report which gives a description of all the methodology of the survey and the quality of the data, and we'll have some other tools available for researchers. Over 2014 and 2015, the intention is to produce a series of thematic reports, and they're going to be more in-depth explorations of the data than is available in the international report. And this is what the cover of the international report will look like. So it will have two volumes. So you can see the cover, but you can't see what's behind it for the moment. So there are going to be two reports, two volumes. The first is the first results from the survey of adult skills, and the second is what we're calling the Reader's Companion, which gives you an overview of the methodology in a sense. It's a layperson's guide to the methodology as opposed to the technical report, which is the specialist's guide. In terms of what's behind the cover, the first skills outlook, that's the first volume, will contain 6 chapters. We give some context to the survey. We look at the results at the national levels and compare them. Then we look at the distribution of results of proficiency across different socio-demographic groups such as age, gender, immigrant status, etc., etc. We have a chapter on workers, the use of skills in the workplace and their proficiency. We then have a chapter on the relationship between these skills and education, so looking at factors such as educational attainment, participation in adult learning, and other background factors, and also the information that we have on the use of skills. And interestingly, practice in these skills turns out to have a very strong relationship with performance, as one might expect. Those people who read more tend to have higher skills, higher proficiency in reading, etc., etc. Again, what's the causality? It's probably a feedback loop. Higher proficiency allows you to read more complex materials and perhaps more fluently. That develops interest in reading, which in its turn reinforces your skills. And I think the same thing happens in terms of problem solving. So, and then the last chapter looks at the link between these information processing skills and outcomes. And there we look primarily at the labour market, but we also have some information on, as I said, on health, volunteering, perceptions of trust in others, and perceptions of impact on the political process. And as I said, the Reader's Companion is an overview of what is measured and how the survey is implemented in layperson's terms. The thematic reports, well, the main thing, I guess, in terms of this presentation here is that we will be doing a report on what we call managing information in technology-rich environments. And the objective there is to go into more detail than's done in the initial report about the information that's provided on both problem solving in technology-rich environments and also digital reading, but also the information that's provided about practice, to explore similarities and differences between countries in terms of access to information, how people do it, performance, and try and relate that to other information that we have from other sources, such as information about internet penetration or computer penetration, etc., etc., in countries. So, and that's really all that I have for you today. The information, there is a website which is there. There's information on the website. There's at the moment, and there'll be more information on the website from the 8th of October at 11 o'clock Paris time, which is GMT plus 1. So.